everybody can see that all right. Just my normal, and I will read this out because I've got a couple of people on a phone. So let's just hang on a moment. Just as soon as I put the slides up, it changed my other screens. As usual, we're here today to talk about landlords and energy requirements and MEES, minimum energy efficiency standard, and what you have to do to meet MEES, which they give it a different name for one thing. So what we're talking about, as I say, is MEES requirements. Let someone else in. And as it says there, that this came in quite some while ago, and really we've always been banging on about it for quite some time, so it should not be a surprise to you. But it came in really in force in April last year, April 2020, so it's over a year since it's been in force. That if you've got a property with an EPC rating of below E, you cannot let it out unless you've got a valid exemption in place. So what we're here to talk about today is how you can get those exemptions, and ways that perhaps you can improve your property. So it's just got some more people coming in. Come on. There we go. So if you're if it says there, if you're currently letting a property with an FLG rating and you've not taken action to improve it, or you've not got an exemption, then you're not allowed to continue letting it. You will have problems with that. So there are fines associated with this. I'm not aware. I'd be interested to hear from our experts in a minute whether anyone's aware of anybody being fined. I've not actually heard of it, but there's a potential there. So the potential is, as it says there, that the fine could be up to £5,000 or 10% of the rateable value, up to a maximum of 50,000, which is great, whichever is greater. So you've got the potential for a serious fine there, and that's the first time round. Second time round, it could be either £10,000 or 20% of the rateable value, up to a maximum of £150,000. So do be careful. And if you give misleading information, there can be another fine for up to £5,000 for supplying false or misleading information. For those of you that are on computers, you can see this. I'm reading them out because we do have people on telephones. So the other thing you need to be aware of, and I hope we'll get some comments on this a bit later on, although this is, I put possible here, it is highly likely that the current rating of a minimum of E will be changed for a minimum of C from April 2025. The reason I put a range there, April 2025 to April 2028, is if they do the same as they did last time, which is that when they introduced the new requirement, they made it from the first date for any new lettings, and then the final date was for all lettings. So we're guessing they're going to be doing the same thing again. And then just the last bit for my little bit before we move on, the 7 reasons you can claim an exemption are there. So high cost, 7-year payback, all improvements made, wall insulation, consent, devaluation, new landlord. I'll just very quickly go through those. I'll just let someone else in. So the high cost is very basically, there's a cap at the moment of £3,500, including VAT. And I'm sure my learning colleagues will shout at me if I've got that wrong, but which is basically, if you can't, even if the cheapest thing you need to do to improve your property is more than £3,500, including VAT, then you're not expected to do it. That's a reason for an exemption. 7-year payback is basically that the matters that you're going to do will take more than 7 years to pay back. So I mean, the prime example there, and I'm sure Phil comments on this, is something like double glazing. that seems to take forever to pay back. So from this alone, it can't be justified. If you look at your EPC, you look at your EPC, and the potential rating and the actual rating are the same, then you can't make any amendments to the property. Then that's the reason for an exemption. If you're expected to put wall insulation in, and for whatever reason there's no appropriate wall insulation available, so there could be lots of reasons for that, particularly following Grenfell, and a comment we had earlier on is if you try and put wall insulation in and it reduces the internal size of your property too much. And then you've got the consent exemption, where you're unable to get consent. The main ones there could be planning consent, or say you've got a superior landlord. Mortgage company might not get, it's an unusual one, or you might not be able to get consent from the tenants to go in and do the work. So, you know, if you can't get consent, that's the reason for an exemption. Devaluation. So if you were to do the work to the property, it would devalue it too much. And then the last one is the new landlord exemption. So this is a temporary exemption where, particularly if you've just bought or inherited a property and it's got a low EPC rating, but you're not proposing to continue letting it out, what, you know, you're going to live it yourself or whatever's going to happen to it, you can get a temporary exemption. Now, with all of these, you obviously need proof. So you can't just go along and say, I want my exemption, thank you very much, and away you go. So you do need proof. The other thing I would say, by the way, is if any of you want copies of the slides, please, hopefully we'll check with our other presenters in a moment, but certainly have to make mine available. Just email us info@ihouse.uk, info@ihouse.uk, and I'd be happy to pass them on. But I'm pleased to say that we've got speakers. We've got Christabel is going to kick us off. Christabel's spoken before. She's from the Environment Centre in Southampton. Then we've got Fiona or Fee Wilson from Elmhurst Energy, if you introduce yourself, and Bean Beanland from the Heat Pump Federation. We'll be talking about heat pumps and various other things, shall we say. So, you know, I trust that all of this will kick off some discussion, shall we say. So, Christabel, let's unmute you, or you unmute yourself. The floor is yours. Please, away you go.
Brilliant, thanks, Peter. So you asked me here to talk a bit about MEES and a bit about the Green Home Grant. So as you've already said in your presentation, that there is this proposed change in the new fuel poverty strategy, which has become a sustainable warmth strategy, that it will be a requirement for new properties to be C by 2025 and existing properties to be C by 2028. And what it also means is they'll be increasing the cost cap. So at the moment, where it says that you have to spend £3,500 or you can get an exemption, it looks like it's going to increase to £10,000. So obviously that's a much higher. Also, there'll be a priority on fabric first, so that the exemption that you'll be trying to get insulation before sort of low carbon heating and things like that, because obviously it's better to save energy first before you try and create it through other means. And they're also reviewing the housing health and safety rating system that private sector housing teams and councils use to enforce standards, and linking those two up, and also updating some of the information and guidance around that. So those are all the proposals. We say proposals, but this is generally what happens. They consult on it, and it's often ends up being the case, and that certainly was the case with MEES last time. So I think we are heading in that direction, and I think in terms of landlords and future proofing, it's probably worth thinking about getting towards a C or higher if possible, just so that you then don't have to worry about it. You don't have to worry about being able to rent out your properties in years to come. I don't know if any of you have any non-domestic properties or know people with non-domestic properties, but it's slightly different for that. They're already at E for new properties, just like domestic. And the plan is for E for existing properties by 2023, but they've interestingly been consulting on B by 2030. So it looks like for non-domestic properties, they're going to go straight to B, and that will be by 2030. So obviously that's quite a huge increase over 7 years for those non-domestic properties. So that's in terms of MEES. I'm happy to talk a bit more about that if people have questions in a second, but I just wanted to sort of touch on the Green Homes Grant. I know that I've spoken before about that at meetings, and I'm sure all of you are aware that there were some difficulties accessing that funding and a very short time scale, and it got extended, and then it got actually closed on the 31st of March this year. So if anyone was able to apply, then you were only able to apply up until the 31st of March. And so that's the general voucher scheme. So that was up to £5,000 towards cost of primary and secondary measures. And the way it's changed, the way that it's being delivered. So alongside that scheme that was running, there was a local authority delivery element. And that was already running in certain areas, but it's now going to be only run through local authority delivery. So you may still hear the term Green Homes Grant popping up, and that's because it's being done via energy hubs in each area, which are linked to the local enterprise partnerships, and then through individual local authorities. So some of them are already up and running. Anyone who's local might know that the Portsmouth Council have a consortium with some other Hampshire local authorities, and they're already running that scheme, but the others are sort of setting up as we speak, and will be running for the rest of this year. I think the two areas that would be covered by this group would be the Southeast Energy Hub and the Southwest Energy Hub, which does cover kind of a bit of the south coast along here, but most of the Southeast is covered by the Southeast Energy Hub, and I can share their details, and they will probably know the most up-to-date information on what is going on in the different local authorities. But just broadly, it's up to the different areas to decide how the funding is allocated, but it looks like that it will be based on eligibility, so based on the low-income household or disability, and that would be for the tenants, and that they may continue the primary secondary measure from Green Homes Grant, or they may actually just have measures that you can get. So in some senses, if you have an eligible tenant, it might be easier to get that funding than it was for the previous voucher scheme, because of the widening of the measures. So that's sort of the Green Homes Grant and the direction of that is going. The one final thing I wanted to say is that we at the Environment Centre, because we're aware of all these issues, the end of the Green Home Grant voucher scheme, the difficulty finding funding for some of these measures, the difficulty getting advice and information, and the proposed changes to MEES, the recent extension of the electrical safety regulations that have just been brought in April, and so there's lots and lots of things that landlords are thinking about and having to keep on top of. So we have been doing a survey to try and work out how we can best help landlords and what services we can offer to landlords and tenants going forward around all of these. So hopefully, if it's okay with all of you, I will share that survey link in the chat, and then you can all join, have your voice heard. So some of the questions are around sort of what barriers do you face when meeting the energy efficiency and housing standards, sort of common issues that tenants contact you around energy. Is there any additional support that would be useful to you? What's the best way of communicating with you? And also, how can we reach those landlords who don't meet regulations? So I'm pretty sure that all of you here will be meeting the regulations because you turn up to these events and you're trying to keep on top of it and doing your best as landlords. But there are landlords out there that aren't meeting those regulations, and if you have any thoughts on what we can do to a bit of carrot and stick perhaps of trying to raise the standards across the sector, and that would be great. So yeah, I'll share that survey, and as I said, happy to answer questions on any of the other areas that I've touched upon, but yeah, happy to hand over now to the next speaker and before the Q&A.
All right, well, thank you very much, Christabel. As you said, a lot going on, so thanks for all of that. I'm just going to mute you if I can do so. Next in line, we've got Fee Wilson from Elmhurst. Elmhurst are the sort of really the de facto standard for, particularly for EPC assessors. But Fee, hopefully you can share your screen and you can go away from there. So I'll stay on for a moment, just make sure you're going all right. So, yeah, you can see that.
Okay. Hopefully you can all see that there.
Yep.
So I'll try and rattle through some of the slides I've got here, because there'll be some that are more interesting to you guys than others. And some of them we all know lots about already, but just in case, I'm going to assume everybody knows nothing, because that tends to be the safest way to do this. So my name's Fee. I'm one of the BDMs at Elmhurst Energy. So I'm just going to run through what EPCs are. So some of you will probably already know a good amount about EPCs, some of you might not. What the process is for gathering that information, how that comes through us, and then the modelling and the report options that are available for assessors to help you get the most out of your property. So just to briefly touch on who we are as a scheme. So we're one of the accreditation schemes that are available for energy assessors in the industry. We are the largest accreditation scheme, with more than half of the EPCs that are lodged in the UK come through our scheme every year. We were established back in 1993, so we're actually one of the original developers of SAP and then RDSAP when that came in. And we have over 7,500 members. That's across all strands, so domestic, non-domestic, new builds, public buildings. And as we're the largest scheme, we also deliver a lot of training, with 3,500 delegates put through our training last year. So a lot of that was online because of COVID. So this is the sort of thing we do. So EPCs are our bread and butter, and in making sure everybody's aware and understanding is the key part of my job. So just to quickly look at what EPCs are, a bit of the history behind them and what the future is for them. So let's see here. So what are EPCs? Most of you will have seen an EPC. You've heard about EPCs, otherwise MEES wouldn't make much sense to you at all. But there are some aspects of EPCs that are perhaps not
We could ask you, are you able to turn your volume up a little bit? It's quite low this end. So
I don't know. Let me see. Let's see.
Otherwise,
is that any better?
Yeah, well, a little bit. We'll just all have to be very quiet. So, okay, thank you.
It's not often I'm accused of being quiet. So I'll try and talk a bit louder. EPCs themselves, you've got that A to G rating. Now, the rating itself is an asset rating. So it's done based on the property itself, not how it's used. And that's one of the most common queries that comes about. My bills are not the same as what the EPC said. The idea being you can compare two properties in two different parts of the country that are being used by different people and determine how they would compare to each other. The other important aspect of that A to G rating is on domestic properties. It's based around cost, not carbon. And that's something that's quite often not well known. So that A to G rating is currently based on cost, which is why when you apply an electric measure, whilst electric is 100% efficient, it's not that cheap. So that will hopefully change as RDSAP progresses in the future, which I'll touch on just shortly. The final point with EPCs is they are non-invasive. So that means the assessor can only take down information that they can see on the day when they're in that property. They can't pull up floorboards, they can't drill into walls, they can't go moving things around in the loft. It's all based around what they can see. And there are assumptions made within the software. And one of the most common queries we get as a scheme is the assessor has assumed this, the assessor has assumed that, because that's what it says on the EPC. The assumption is made by the software based on a number of factors that the assessor gathers, things like the property's age and the build form. And if they can't determine that there's been additional insulation put in, they will assume it's built to those building regs, which is where that assumption comes in. The brief history of EPCs, they were originally part of something called the EPBD, so the European Building Directives. So it was around energy efficiency and us reporting on it. Before the EPBD came in, we had SAP ratings, both Elmhurst and NHER, both of whom have merged together. So that was the original SAP rating as such. EPBD came in 2007. So you might have heard terms like the home condition reports and home information packs. So that's where the EPC moved out from the home condition report and into the HIP itself. And then as time's gone on, we've had developments like Green Deal, which is considered a bit of a bad word in the industry. It didn't work too well. And sort of regular updates to EPCs. So where EPCs were originally developed, they were just for marketed sale and rental. And as time's gone on, EPCs are being used for a multitude of different things, including MEES, so the minimum energy efficiency standards for the private rental sector in England and Wales. It's not in Scotland yet. That's a whole other kettle of fish that's coming through hopefully very soon. But it's a key metric that's being used by government. In constant talks with the likes of MHCLG and BEIS, and they do like EPCs because it's the data that they can gather, data they can analyse, and statisticians love data. So the EPC is a key part of their future, how they see things changing, how they see new funding coming in, new legislations. So we're seeing it used in MEES. We're likely to see it, well, we are seeing it within PAS 2035, which is a methodology for retrofits. And that's going to be the methodology that is used within a lot of funding that comes out from government and even on the private side from banks. It's also being used within ECO, which is the Energy Company Obligation. I will say there is not an industry like this one for acronyms. So if you are struggling with any of them, please let me know. Some of them just sort of trip off the tongue quite easily. Slightly separate to MEES as well, though, we've got two other areas that EPCs are being used for a bit more. So we've had a consultation out recently around lenders. So mortgage lenders actually having to report on the average SAP of their stock, and also around social landlords having to monitor their fuel poverty targets. So the document itself is used in a number of places. So it does have to be accurate. It does have to be done well. We can't have assessors going out and just trying to get the best possible score for the property, because if it doesn't reflect the property itself, it won't actually meet some of the legal requirements around it. Going forward, we see the EPCs here to stay. Yeah, the EPBD is no longer a factor in British law, but EPCs have been brought into British law under the Great Repeal Bill. So EPCs we're seeing in all of the consultations and all of the legislation that's coming out, they are definitely here to stay, being the main thing. In September last year, the document itself moved from being under Landmark, which is where they were all lodged, to MHCLG. This means MHCLG are taking a bit more interest in what's on the document and what we can use that document for in the future. That gives a lot of potential for changes in terms of the moment the EPC is now visible online. So if there's new funding mechanisms that are available, that will be updated in real time, as opposed to previously where you had the hard copy document. As Christabel's mentioned, there's been consultations around MEES, looking at moving that up the ratings. And we'll see that also in Scotland to come soon as well. And I've mentioned the lenders consultations. So EPCs are a benchmark, and they are going to be staying. There will be changes within the methodology though, and that's something that will be key to you going forward. So the methodology is the complicated bit in the background that does all of the calculations. And there are certain figures that are set within that by government, and that's how the results come out of the system, is certain things are taken into account. The methodology itself hasn't been updated for quite some time, and we're hoping to get an update to it in the next year to 18 months. The first changes will be done on new build, and then that will trickle through into existing build. The main change that will affect you as landlords or as tenants or as energy assessors or anybody really in the world is that electricity will be better reflected within the software. So the cost of electrically heating your home will be reflected more accurately, especially now we're seeing a major decarbonisation of the grid going on. So looking at the assessment process, what the assessor does when they're in the property, the information they gather. So anybody that's coming out to do an EPC for you has to be properly qualified. If you're ever unsure if they're qualified, you can search for them on the central register, or if they're with us or with another scheme, you go onto their site and check for them there. Every energy assessor has to do CPD, it's continued professional development, and that's just to make sure they are up to speed on all the new things that are coming out. We were talking just before this about the fact that the technology is changing all the time. There's all sorts of new things coming in all the time, so assessors have to be as up to speed on that. And then the assessor is then audited by us. So we will request all of the evidence that they take. So when they're out at your properties, they will be taking photographs, they will be making notes. We will audit a certain percentage of them and determine that they're accurate. If we pick up an issue with it, the assessor may contact you to say they need to come back out again, or they need to reissue it because there's been an error. It doesn't necessarily mean that the assessor has done anything particularly wrong. There's a lot of information for them to gather. There's a lot of decisions for them to make. And the idea of the audit is not to penalise, but to educate. I've mentioned most of what's on the slide just now around what the methodology is. So as I said, RDSAP is the methodology behind it. So it's reduced data SAP. It makes all of these assumptions based on the data that can be gathered, like the age of the property. And it will also use a standard occupancy rather than looking at what the current occupant uses it for. Regular updates is something we have been promised. We have seen not as many as we'd like in recent years, but we have had a promise that that's going to be updated more often. And then finally, that it's the evidence and information that is taken on the day. So if you are intending on doing something, the assessor can't create that in the EPC. It has to be how it is there in the day. Look at it a little bit like an MOT. If you're planning on changing your tires in 2 weeks, you'll still fail the MOT regardless because that's not been done yet. When it comes to them coming out to the property, it is important that they have access to everything that they can so they can give you the most accurate and hopefully the best rating that they can. So they will need access to things like the boiler or the hot water cylinder. They'll need access around the whole property, so front and back, and access to the loft where possible. That's where they'll gather a lot of the information. If you've had work done to the property that's not visible by the naked eye, so if you've had a whole load of cavity wall insulation, if you've had loft insulation, but then you've boarded it over, if you can keep any certificates and evidence of the work that you've had done and provide that to the assessor, then they can take that into account with the data they gather. So as I've said, it's not an invasive survey. They can't go ripping things up. If you've had work done, keep those certificates, keep that evidence. And as long as it's property specific, so it says the address of that property and the date that it was done, they should be able to use that and include that information rather than having to default to the worst case scenarios. The other thing that comes up when we're speaking to assessors is things like they need the time and the ability to gather that evidence and information. I know quite a lot of the time tenants will be hanging over their shoulders or will suddenly need to leave about 10 minutes after the assessor's arrived. It does take a bit of time. It's not sort of a fly in and take a couple of photographs. They've got a lot of things that they've got to do. So they've got to measure the full property, look up the heating systems, look for extensions and conservatories, look for where the building is slightly different, gather any information on any new technologies or green technologies, and information on the windows and doors. There's loads more in there, but it's not just a case of them coming in, counting the light bulbs and being done with it. So they do need that time and information that they need to gather. I just briefly touch on what we do as a scheme. So if you do have any issues or any queries, you can come to us. We provide the training, we provide the accreditation, and we provide the software for the energy assessors. So all assessors have to be accredited. And as part of that, they get obviously the access to the software, they get our technical support. So if they're unsure of something, they can contact our support help desk who are there to help them. We will check that they're insured. We will check that they have an up-to-date DBS check, a criminal record check, and that there's nothing outstanding or scary on that. We will regularly audit them, and we will sometimes pass them on additional information and ask them to either do further CPD or to make any changes to the EPC itself. We also provide complaint escalation. So if you have an issue with an EPC or the information you've been given, so your first place to go is to speak to the assessor. After that, if you're not happy with their response, or if they feel they can't help any further, it can then be escalated up to the scheme. So if you do have any queries or concerns, please feel free to get in touch with the scheme. The EPC will show you which scheme that assessor has been a member of, and they will then be able to help you. And the bit that I think most people are interested in is around the report types and how to model the potential changes to your property so that you can get the most out of it. So from Elmhurst, there's 3 different ways that we offer our members to do that on your behalf. So the first is the EPC. So it's a document we've been talking about. It's a legal document. It's lodged to the central register, and it is required to meet things like the MEES requirements. It is a legal and very important document. The energy report is slightly different. The energy report has been developed by us. It uses RDSAP, so it gathers all of the same data as the EPC, but it's not lodged to the central register. So it's not a legal document. It can be used to determine if a property is compliant with MEES. But what it means is there's not a multitude of reports lodged on your property to the central register. It's also been created in a slightly easier to read and understand format. And I'll show you some examples of that. The third option we've got for our members to offer you is something called Recommendation Selector. This is a new tool that we've developed for our members. And what they can do is they can look at an EPC, pull in that information, and they can adjust the order of the recommendations that are on the EPC. So on your EPC, as you get it, you have a list of recommendations. Those recommendations are ordered in a particular way. So you have to do this one, then this one, then this one in order to achieve a particular rating. Recommendation Selector allows you to sort of play around with those orders a bit better. So the EPC we've mentioned previously, it's no longer a PDF, it is now completely online. You can download a PDF from the website if you need it. They are hoping that everyone will move to the electronic system like they have now for MOTs and driving licenses. There is more information available there, and changes will be made as time goes on so that you can see different information as and when new funding initiatives or changes to RDSAP are made. That EPC is a lodged report, it's lodged to MHCLG, it is insured, it is audited. We make sure everything is as good as possible with it. And finally, with that, you can do sort of a breakdown and look into the data so you can see all the recommendations and the order in which they suggest as part of the EPC. The energy report is our version, as I mentioned, so it's all that RDSAP data still, but it comes in a slightly easier to read format and is available as a PDF from the member. So it's been designed to make it as easy as possible. It's how we'd actually like EPCs to look. Because it's sometimes the EPC can be a little bit complex to look through and actually understand what it is that they're suggesting. So it will show you things like the individual impact of each recommendation. So if the fourth recommendation down gives you the 5 points you need to move you up into the next band, you can see that one there by itself, what it will do, rather than having to go through the list and apply each one. The assessor can also provide you with this report with the data inputs or without. With the data inputs means you can see the information that they've gathered. So you can obviously yourself check that you're happy with the information gathered does match up with what you know of your property. And also keep it for your records if there's anything in there that you're wanting to see. I know that's an aspect some of the social landlords or landlords with multiple properties like to have, so they can compare and contrast other properties they own. A recommendation selector is the third product. This is the new one. So where on the EPC you have that cumulative rating, what this will show is each of the recommendations and the individual rating change for each of them. The assessor can then play around with them, show you which recommendations will give you which changes and the potential costs and savings. And they'll be able to then provide you with a report that you can then use to make your decisions and design your plans for the future of that property. All Elmhurst members have access to all three of these. And with the recommendation selector, if you've had an EPC lodged with us previously, then the assessor will be able to access that and use that rather than having to complete a new one. So if your EPC is not with us, they would have to come out and complete either the EPC or the energy report to get the data to run through the recommendation selector. Any Elmhurst member will be able to help you with any of them and guide you down the best route for you, the best route for your property, and the best way to try and meet some of the targets that are set. And that's all I have for you on that. So thank you very much.
Oh, well, thank you very much for that, Fee. We've had a few things come in while you were talking, particularly about, so I'm going to look off screen here, retrofit assessor, retrofit coordinator. Now, if someone wants to use your model or get hold of an assessor, how can they find an assessor who belongs to Elmhurst in their area?
Yeah, so on our main website, I think somebody has posted, Christabel's very kindly posted
Yeah.
the link to our
Yeah.
search for an assessor section. On our website, you can look for any of our members across any of the strands. So you just select your region, you select the relevant strands, so retrofit assessor, domestic energy assessor, commercial energy assessor, whichever you need, put in your postcode and it'll bring up a list of the 20 assessors that are closest to that area or work in that area. It'll also give you their email addresses and their phone numbers.
Okay, that's terrific. All right. Okay, well, let's move on if I can do, Vivi. I'm going to mute you if I
Yep.
can do. Sorry to be rude, but it's the best thing to do. So we know that we need to do some work to our properties, various things that we can do. One of them is the potential of a heat pump. There are other things that could be done. Bean, take it away. Introduce yourself and tell us what you know there. So.
Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for having me. Hopefully you can see a screen, and I'm hopeful that it will start to advance any second now.
Yeah, we can see it, no problem.
Great, very good. Okay, so I'm going to dance through heat pumps in 10 minutes. There's a lot of material on the slides, which I don't intend to talk through in detail, but the concept here is that you're able to get a copy of the slides, which we'll provide. You can review them at your leisure, and then you can make contact with the Federation directly if you so choose for any information. But I'm going to try and dance you through heat pump technology, what it can do, what potentially it can't do, for those of you with private rental properties. So the first point I want to get across is that this is the ultimate renewable energy resource, and all of our renewable energies come from the sun. Doesn't matter what technology you're talking about. It's all driven by the sun, including all the heat pump types. Okay, so our ancestors knew where they should be getting their energy from, and that's it. The reason why electrification is carbon efficient, and I appreciate that today the discussion is not necessarily all about carbon, because you have one eye on both capital cost and also running costs for tenants. But to give you a feel for carbon, why electrification is carbon, and electrification in my world means the installation of heat pumps. They're all driven by electricity. The black line across the middle there, that is a gas boiler running on a communal system rather than a private individual boiler. And the various other lines are various types of heat pump deployment, certainly red, green and dark green. The yellow line, or the cream line, which increases, that is actually gas CHP, which is combined heat and power. The reason that's going up in carbon intensity is that the value of the electricity that it generates in a carbon, measured by carbon, is actually going down, because of course electricity is increasingly carbon efficient. So it's just really to demonstrate that deployment of heat pumps will get you to net zero pretty well by 2050. So that's really what that's telling you. This one is a screenshot from our own website, from Carbon Watch, which again presents the same concept but in a slightly different way. I'm sorry, it's a bit of a blurry image. The black vertical line is 519 grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour. That is the current carbon factor for grid electricity in SAP. It should be a source of national embarrassment that we're still sitting with that figure in SAP. It's been there since 2012, and I'm sure most of you understand that the grid electricity has been decarbonising very heavily in the last 10 years. So that is a pretty awful indictment, and it has all sorts of implications for planning and what have you, which is a tragedy. But the bar charts basically show different types of technology and the carbon implications. At the bottom, you've got coal. The next one up is oil. The next one up is gas. The next one up is direct electric, so wall panel heaters or immersions. And then a couple of heat pump efficiencies systems. So I think we've got 320% and 400%, and you can look at this on your website. It updates in real time. You can select the region and it will tell you exactly what's going on from day to day and hour to hour. Very quickly, this is the sort of outcome, again, in carbon, that you can expect to get from deploying heat pumps. This is a pretty standard domestic dwelling, 10,000 kilowatt hours a year, there about 7,800, with a pretty average heat pump performance of 320%, or a coefficient of performance of 3.2. The two interesting columns really at the end, percentage of CO2 savings with a heat pump. You can see that even against natural gas, we're already well above 50%. And this is with the carbon factor for grid electricity as is currently in the DEFRA figures, not in the SAP figures. And importantly, from local authorities' perspective, because they like to see it in a way that they recognise pretty well, any heat pump is going to effectively take the equivalent of carbon emissions out of the system, the equivalent of displacing one family car. So you know, quite significant. And this is for, let's say, a pretty average domestic dwelling scenario. Quick word about heat efficiency hierarchy, because I think this is it ties in with one or two of the things that have been said already today in terms of general efficiency and fabric first approach. So waste heat, you lose heat, you lose clearly. So building fabric is vitally important. Insulation is vitally important. And it's a factor in everything that you've seen from the Committee on Climate Change. All of their reports make assumptions about significant levels of building fabric improvement. So absolutely mustn't be underestimated. Waste heat you harvest, you win. Now this is about waste heat that could be somewhere else. And in the hierarchy, waste heat that comes from a factory, a power station, a supermarket, you name it, if we can recover it, clearly that's very good news. Now the waste heat might be over the fence. So if you've got a rental property, say someone has a stack of apartments and there's an industrial complex next door which is pouring out waste heat, that's a source of heat for you. So very important that we keep aware of those, and we'd like to see local authorities having an obligation to look for sources of waste heat and make use of it using heat pumps. Again, lots of talk in the press lately about using mine water. Again, that's a source of waste heat. Heat from self-generated sources. So again, you may have some other form of local generation going on site. So you may be generating electricity on site, which you can use to drive a heat pump. And then heat from bought-in resources, and clearly that's these utilities that you're buying on a regular basis. So that's the hierarchy of heat efficiency from our perspective. Very quick slide on heat pump, on what a heat pump is. Now, I would say if I could see everyone on screen, I can't. I can only see a few. You know, hands up those who've got a heat pump. Probably not many hands up, I suspect. Peter, are there many hands up?
No, I don't think so. I'm only aware of one landlord who's got a heat pump, actually.
Okay. So I must tell you, slightly trick question, because you all own heat pumps. All your properties have got heat pumps in already. There is nothing scary in heat pump technology. You have relied on heat pumps to keep your milk fresh and your peas frozen for decades. So all we're doing is using exactly the same technology that's in your fridge and freezer in a different way. If you reach behind your fridge when you go home tonight, or in your office, if you've got a fridge in the office, reach behind it, feel the heat. We're just using it the other way around. So it's really important that people grasp that this is not scary new technology. This is actually a technology that predates all fossil fuel boilers. Quick look at what they look like. Again, important. I think many people probably don't really know what they look like, and I've included the sort of devices here that you might see for most domestic rental type properties. So on the right hand side of the screen are air source monoblock units in various sizes. The unit in the middle at the bottom is a domestic scale ground source heat pump, which is about the format of a dishwasher or washing machine or a tumble dryer. And then the units on the left hand side are, I think, interesting in the rental sector because, well, particularly the two that have got, you can see have got cylinders in. That's the two on the right hand side of that image, because they both produce hot water which has no Legionella implications. So they're producing instantaneous hot water in the same way that a combi boiler does. Bear in mind, a combi boiler, of course, is grotesquely inefficient when it's doing hot water. So this gives you a feel, and those units are the size of an upright fridge freezer. Again, designed to fit into utility rooms, kitchens, even where you would see a fridge. I thought it was also really important to reassure you that you can use any of your existing emitters. So underfloor heating, column radiators, panel radiators, trench heating, fan coils, the unit in the middle is a fan coil. Any of those, we can design heat pump systems that work with any of those. So any of the scare stories you see about you must have underfloor heating, or you must do this, you must do that, absolute nonsense, I'm afraid. As long as you understand the building physics properly, you can do absolutely anything. I thought it was also important to reassure you on building types. So we can operate in any building type, and this slide is a bit slow to move because I think the images are a bit big. There we go. So stacks of apartments, retrofit, no problem. Terraced houses, again, we have a solution. So not all heat pump solutions will fit in every scenario, but there is a heat pump solution for every scenario. It might be individual heat pumps per property. It might be a combination of a single plant room driving a number of properties. So you could have a conventional plant room in the basement of a stack of apartments that could be driven by heat pumps. It could be what we call an ambient loop, which is a particular type of heat network, all sorts of options. And then the shot in the middle I've put up because anyone who's buying investment properties on new developments, you know, if they're in housing developments that have got things like schools and health centres and what have you going up as well, there are potential opportunities for heat networks using the big building in the middle as a source and then driving out to the various residential properties. So lots of options. Again, one more just reassurance slide, and this really talks about the naysayers and those that want us to fail. So basically the incumbents, the gas and hydrogen fraternity. You'll see comments about having to massively double the size of radiators or whatever. Almost certainly not. I spent 8 years as an installer working primarily in listed buildings, and I didn't have to change all the radiators once. You don't have to replumb the whole house. You don't need underfloor heating. You know, great if you've got it, but you don't need it. You know, garden a disaster for ground source, yes, potentially, but it'll all be over in 6 months, and the benefits will be enormous. Central heating, when it was put in, was hugely disruptive. Anybody who can remember this, I remember my grandparents putting in central heating, massively disruptive. I'd spoken to them 6 months later and said, don't you wish you were still bringing in the coal? They'd say, don't be ridiculous. And actually, we're at a very similar point in history now, 60 years on, 50, 60 years on. You know, we were putting in central heating gas to get rid of coal because we had an air quality problem. We now have an air quality problem caused by gas. And so we're actually in the same sort of position politically. Some quick case studies. So these are stacks of apartments in Enfield in London, 400 social housing apartments, 8 blocks. These are on what we call an ambient loop. So we've got boreholes around the building, and we are sharing that energy source up through the building. Each tenant has their own heat pump, so they can be in complete control of their costs. And you can see that their energy costs are down by 30 to 50%, and we've saved 700 tons of CO2 per annum from those 4 apartments. Some social housing bungalows. The one I've shared this one because the unit that's been put in, you can see in the image there, is designed to look like a combi boiler. So the tenants think they've just got a new boiler. You know, there's no resistance because it just looks the same to them. So that was quite a nice piece of marketing by Valent, as it happens. New developments, again, you know, anyone investing in new developments, these houses were put up. They have a shared array of boreholes running down the road in the middle of the road. Each house has its own feed with its own heat pump, and here in this instance we're also doing comfort cooling. So in new build, most complaints about heating services now come on the basis of overheating in new build properties. The great thing about heat pumps in general and ground source in particular is that we can deliver very effective cooling as well as heating. Something on the MEES and district schemes. So if you've got, you might have multiple rental properties in one area. These schemes actually are based around rural landlords who have a number of properties in a village. And we've driven heat networks across, picking up all the buildings and run those from a central resource. So big central plant. And then as the landlord, you can sell the heat, and you can obviously make a margin on that heat if you can generate it very efficiently. So again, lots of options. Tenants and the property owners are key, and this is a slide, you can read it yourself at leisure, on what factors are really important, and it includes things like operational costs. New funding mechanisms are absolutely needed. You know, we entirely accept that the capital cost of putting in heat pumps is high, but of course the capital cost of putting in central heating was high. The comparisons that are being made at the moment, I think, are disingenuous when you'll see in the press, they say, oh, £1,200 for a boiler, £8,000 for a heat pump system. That's true. It is but it's a system. It's all new cylinders, valves, pumps, all with new warranties. The real comparison is replacement boiler with a replacement heat pump when it comes up for replacement. And bear in mind that most heat pumps will do 15 to 20 years for good air source, 20 to 25 for good ground source. Most boilers now won't last more than 8 to 12 years. So you have a longer replacement cycle with heat pump technology. We're going to have some new policy, and Fee touched upon the developments within Part L of building regulations and how they will filter through to SAP. The one problem we have at the moment is there is no SAP report on the planet that currently recommends a heat pump, because it's all based around cost, and the cost of electricity is currently high. So that is a problem. If you go to the government's simple energy advice service and run through that, you will find that heat pumps do get recommended, but they've had to manipulate the software in order to do that. We are expecting and hoping that that will be changing over the coming years as carbon becomes more important. The other thing to note is that SAP at the moment, and Fee, you'll correct me if I'm wrong here, but my belief is that SAP does not recognise thermal storage and time of use tariffs. In this instance, we can run heat pumps overnight on a time of use tariff in the same way you would charge an electric vehicle at 4p a kilowatt hour or whatever it is, store the heat and bleed it into the building when the building requires the heat, and drive the cost right down. Now, because SAP is based on cost, that ought to give you a really, really good SAP rating. Currently, it won't. So there are problems within the SAP process that do need to be fixed. But again, the point here is there are solutions that can deliver all these benefits, not only for you as the landlords, but also for your tenants. Of course, if the properties are more attractive for the tenants' perspective, that must be good news. What action can be taken? Should you be taking now? There is 11 months to go on the domestic renewable heat incentive. This provides enormous returns for the deployment of heat pump systems. The scheme closes to new applicants on the 31st of March next year. So anybody who is considering doing anything, if you've got boilers that are due for replacement, if you're doing redevelopment, and somebody put a note in the chat saying they were doing some work on the property, please look at this, because there are significant opportunities to get returns from the renewable heat incentive, rather larger in most situations than the value of the Green Homes grant. Yes, it's a 7-year payback because the rate's paid over 7 years, but it is still potentially a very, very valuable asset. You should review your existing assets. You know, what generation assets have you already got? You know, are you able to generate electricity with PV? If you can, and you use it all on site, excellent value. You know, what neighbours? You know, have your neighbours got assets which you could put to better use? What residential developments are planned, within striking distance of you? And there's a note there about the leasing of thermal rights. So if your property borders someone who cannot develop their land, National Trust, Church of England, for example, you may be able to lease the thermal rights off the land. And then, does access to thermal assets open new employment? Well, you know, clearly we're all interested in whether or not we've got employment, because again, that makes your domestic properties that much more valuable if there's local employment. And so I've just thrown in a slight curveball at the end to show you that we are using our technology to create massive new employment in certain places. New seed to drive horticultural development. This particular unit is in Norfolk. It's created 360 full-time jobs, 120 seasonal jobs, and it's brought all this food production onshore. This particular unit is going to produce 12% of the UK's tomato requirement. So we can not only improve the quality of the heating and decarbonise the homes, we can actually create new employment as well for the residents who are renting your properties. And that is a dance. I'm sorry it's a bit rushed. Please do contact us if you want some help. Thank you very much.
Right, well, thank you very much. If you could just stop sharing so we can see, that's lovely. Thank you so much for that. We've got a few questions coming, a few comments, etc., etc. Try and deal with them as best as I can. So excuse me not looking at you. I just love being your idea of over the fence waste heat. So you're nicking the waste heat from next door. So it sounds a really good idea. So
You wouldn't necessarily nick it, you'd do a deal to buy it, but you'd buy it very effectively.
Yeah. But just want to explain a few things if I can, and you know, experts, please jump in when I start saying wrong things, because as people will tell you, I often do. So SAP and RD-SAP's been bandied around. They are really, they're peculiar terms which actually don't mean anything. SAP is SAP, which is Standard Assessment Procedure, which could apply to absolutely anything. They just happen to have used it for working out how properties are energy efficient. So it's a really stupid name. RD-SAP is Reduced Data Standard Assessment Procedure. So I just wanted to also say that the EPC, and I'm sure Phil will shout at me if I say this, but the EPC, particularly as it was used in the early days and still is to a certain extent, is a bit of a blunt instrument. As Fee says, it has to make an awful lot of assumptions. It's non-invasive, so it can't go checking things. So, you know, and I do know, I used to be an assessor, but I was asked not to do it anymore because I wasn't very good. So, so you know, you treat it with a little bit of disdain, shall I say. If you want to do it properly, then I strongly suggest you look at Elmhurst modelling facilities and look at those. What else we got here?
It wasn't you, Peter, who gave one of my clients an EPC that said that the boiler was really nice. And I said, what boiler was that? He said, well, the nice new boiler in the basement. So that's a heat pump.
Yeah, yeah.
Where's the flue? Well, I didn't see a flue.
If you come across any like that, contact the scheme. We'll be more than happy to look at any of them. It's all about education.
I'll come on to some of the questions in a minute, so thank you. Keep sending questions in, I will come on to them. The other thing I would say to you, by the way, is that for those of you with long memories, when EPCs and all the rest of it came in 2005, the government, and this is a political statement with a small p, the government didn't really take it seriously, quite frankly. I mean, they even had a Department of Environmental Change, which even managed to disband that at one stage. So, you know, they really didn't take it seriously, but they are now. So don't think because, you know, they didn't in the early days, but they most certainly are now. Right, we just got a few questions on heat pumps. So I think you answered one of them, which was about the size of the radiators being. So you need to replace your radiator with a bigger radiator. You've already answered that one, so thank you very much.
Yeah, if anybody wants to know the technical reason why that's the case, please do make contact. I'm quite happy to have a conversations offline. Okay.
As I said, Fee, you happy if I share your slides with people as well?
Definitely, yes. Feel free to. So if anyone needs anything, just get in touch, either with myself or any of the team.
And you may notice, by the way, I meant to mention at the beginning, I'm recording this session because the tomorrow night session we'll play the recording, but take questions afterwards. So I propose that when we've edited the session, and Fee and Bin, you were both a little bit quiet, so I'll try and pump the volume up on the video. So hopefully I can put that up onto YouTube and you can also see it there. So again, do send me an email. So what else we got here? We would like, hold on a minute. Right, heat pumps. I'm just going to say a couple of things here, then I'll read the question out for those of you who can't read it. Just be aware that as being said, it's like a fridge working in reverse. So it's a question of where it's taking its heat from. A lot of people seem to suggest that you can only have a heat pump with its business end buried in the soil. Well, you can have, as Bina has suggested, a heat pump where its business end is out in the air. So it's taking heat from the air, especially as this delightful subject of where you're stealing it from next door. So the question was, don't understand how you get heat for installing a heat pump. If as a landlord you have a terrace house with no back access, so with cement gardens, etc., basically, how do you manage air? One would presume you're talking about an air source heat pump, Bean.
Yes. If you want or need to do something in the short term, it's air source, and most domestic gas units will fit through a front door and out the back door and into the back garden. There are requirements around noise management, which you would have to meet. But longer term, if a residential street, for example, and we have a couple of bodies, including UK Power Networks, looking at street-by-street approaches, potentially you could get a third-party investor to run a series of boreholes up the street and then offer all those property owners a connection, which would be a ground source connection in that instance. So rather than necessarily charging off and doing individual things, there are potential values coming around heat networks being delivered. I don't want to stop anybody doing anything individual by any means, because you can always connect to a heat network at a later date. It's just like the rural broadband rollout, where they went down the rural lanes, they put a pot for fibre broadband outside every house and said connect if you want. So there will be a number of, that's why I said there are a number of architectures of heat pump technology that could fit in any given scenario. But yeah, air source, if you've got restricted access, no garden, whatever it might be, air source is definitely an option.
I mean, I would say, by the way, that we're just talking about one of the methods that we can improve energy efficiency. I did try and get someone to talk about insulation as well, but failed with that. But obviously, if you can stop throwing it away, that's got to be a good start. So apart from how you make it, so we've got. Let me just read this. Oh, hang on, I don't have gas in one of my properties. It's subdivided into 5 separate flats, and one small starter home. Have night storage heaters installed throughout the property. Was converted in 2005. I presume to use heat pumps, I'll need to install a central heating radiator system in each flat and in one in the house. Is there an economy of scale if I install a heat pump that will serve all 5 properties, and with each property will have to control their own cost? So basically, what we're asking there is, if you've got a non-wet system, I specifically didn't say non-gas because you can get electric boilers. So if you've not got the standard radiators driven by water, heated water, then what's the prospects of putting a heat pump in being? So sorry, Fee and Christabel, but a lot of questions coming about heat pumps. So.
Yeah, yes, Martin, look, the answer is yes, you can. You will certainly need a wet. You could do it with blown air, but fundamentally, in an ideal world, yes, you'd retrofit wet systems. In fact, the 4 tower blocks example that I showed, that case study, all of those tower blocks were on electric panel heaters, and the tenants were largely on prepaid meters, and so they were paying a fortune for their electricity. And those all had very simple radiator wet systems put in retrospectively, relatively down and dirty. So I suspect that the pipework was probably surface mounted and what have you. but was done cost effectively. And you're quite right, if you did them all at once, you would be able to get a reasonable deal. They could have their own heat pumps. They could have a central plant if you've got room for central plant somewhere in the block, and then you could become, the seller of the heat. So there are a number of ways of architecting that. Again, it could be air source. And then the other thing which you mustn't necessarily rule out, and there was a lot of questions about New Zealand earlier. In New Zealand, most of the heating, domestic heating, is actually air to air, what we will call air conditioning units. So you could do a lot worse than say, well, actually we'll do it with air conditioning. In terms of efficiency, it's probably twice as efficient as resistive heat, air to air. Air to water would be probably 50% more efficient than that, and ground source another 50% more efficient again. So, there's a hierarchy of efficiency, but obviously air conditioning systems, so air to air, very cheap to install.
All right, we've got a couple more questions coming in. One again about heat pumps. If you've got an air source heat pump, so it's got its business end sticking out the window, for put it crudely, it doesn't need light to work on, so it's not solar panels. It's just literally sucking the heat out of the air and then transferring it to inside the house, pretty crudely. But there was a question, I don't know if you want to answer it directly so people know, being about what's the minimum temperature that an air source heat pump will work at.
Yeah, so again, lots of chatter in the UK about air source doesn't work. In our climate, it does. I mean, air source is in routine use in Scandinavia. Most of the domestic heat pumps installed in the UK will operate down to -15 external air temperature. Clearly, the colder the air, the less efficient the device is, but it will still be significantly more efficient than a direct resistive heat, for example. And you have to bear in mind that that efficiency only drops when the air temperature drops. So in the shoulder months of the year, when it's 12, 13 degrees outside and you still need heating inside, then the efficiency is very high. So one's got to be a little bit careful about what you read saying air source isn't very efficient. If it's done well, it's like anything else. You do it well, the outcomes can be tremendous. If you do it badly, the outcomes are awful. And the other thing to bear in mind is that anybody doing significant work on properties from probably July next year, when the new version of building regs is enacted, will be obliged to design their radiator systems, underfloor radiators, anything, to operate at less than 55 degrees. Because above that temperature, there's no guarantee the boilers are in condensing mode. And so we have spent the last 16 years since we mandated for condensing boilers, kidding ourselves about the efficiency thereof. And at 55 degrees, actually, that's a perfectly fine winter temperature for heat pumps to operate at. So there's a lot of other changes coming in that will already make buildings progressively more heat pump friendly.
Yeah, and I feel, I think we're going to be getting a talk, we need to arrange a talk next year on the new building regs when they're sorted out, so no point doing it now. Good question coming, is there a cost attached to getting a quote to move into heat pump technology? So can you get a free quote?
Most installers will give you a pretty good feel for costs. Just as with anything else, as soon as you need people to come out and start assessing the property, then you're probably going to be incurring costs. Some installers may be happy to come out and give you a view. There are a number of ways of going to the market though. You could go straight to installers and you'll get the installer's view. You could go to an independent consultant, get a scheme specified, and then let them help you take that to market. So the gentleman with the block that's got 6 properties in it, effectively, that might be an effective way of going about it. It shouldn't in the end cost you more, because you're going to incur all of the assessment costs anyway, and you should, by getting really good advice, end up with a more effective route to the market. So there's a number of ways of going about it, but most installers, I think, would give you a reasonable feel. They'd probably do it off the EPC, but the EPC is not a design tool in our world. So that would have to then be validated by doing formal heat loss calculations using a British standard methodology. So But yeah, I think you'd get a reasonable feel from most installers of what your costs are likely to be.
Okay, and the question, how do you find an installer? Presumably by going to your website?
Yeah, so there are a number of resources actually. I mean, we've got about 40 installer members, so not very many, but we're predominantly a lobbying body, so we're not really an installers body, but we do have installers listed on our website. We have advice for landowners and advice for homeowners, for property owners and homeowners, so do take a look at that. The Ground Source Heat Pump Association, one of our sister organisations, they have more installers on their books. And then the other resource is the Microgeneration Certification Scheme, MCS. They have all the MCS certified installers listed, about 1,000 of them altogether. So you can use that resource, and I believe that is replicated on the Trustmark website if you were searching for heat pump installers on the Trustmark website. So there are a number of resources, and then the final one would be many of the heat pump manufacturers run what we call umbrella schemes, where they have certified installers who are not MCS certified in their own right, but they operate under the manufacturer's MCS registration. So again, if you were, for instance, if you are a particular fan of Vaillant boilers and you were considering heat pumps, you could do a lot worse and speak to your Vaillant rep and ask them for recommendations around Vaillant installers in your turf. Because Vaillant do have an MCS umbrella scheme, and so they would be able to help you. So there's a number of routes to market. Okay.
Right. Well, thank you so much. We've covered an awful lot there. Christabel, is there anything you want to say in closing to add to all of that? Because there's an awful lot going on. By the way, for those of you not being able to see the chat box, Christabel's been hammering away there, giving all sorts of different answers. So thank you very much. I have got a copy of it, so I will do a précis of the questions there and Christabel's points. So thank you for that, Christabel. Is there anything you want to add to that?
And thank you, Peter. So just as I said, thank you so much to everyone who's filled out the surveys so far. That's really, really helpful. I've seen all the responses come in, so I'm really grateful for that. And if you are a landlord based in Hampshire, Portsmouth or Southampton, or you have tenants based in Hampshire, Portsmouth or Southampton, then we have our free phone advice to sort of answer any energy queries at all. If you're further afield, we won't turn you away, but we'll just be limited in what support we can give you because of the way that we're funded and the partners that we work with. But yeah, so please, if you've got any tenants who are struggling locally, we'd be happy to help. Or if you do want to find out more information about the Green Home Grant Local Authority scheme over the next few months, if you can't get any luck with your energy hub, then get in touch with us and we can point you in the right direction.
So Christabel covers the whole country now. Thank you very much. not just Hampshire and around there. So Fee, anything you would like to add at the end of all of that?
No, nothing really. Just for any information, we've got a news section on our website or social media. Any updates that come out about MEES consultations or requirements around DPCs will go up on there.